So, Buckingham Palace has just officially confirmed that Princess Anne is taking over absolutely all of Queen Camilla's official state duties starting immediately. And honestly, the unprecedented, chilling way this entire situation went down is vastly more revealing than the sterilized public announcement itself. This was absolutely not a minor scheduling conflict, a temporary health-related step back, or a gentle transition of power. It was a direct, catastrophic consequence of something that happened behind closed doors weeks ago, and the undeniable fact that King Charles signed off on this personally tells you absolutely everything you need to know about exactly how serious this breach of trust actually was. Before we get deeply into the incredibly messy, behind-the-scenes details of this constitutional crisis, do us a quick favor and hit subscribe to Monarch Access so you never miss the actual truth behind these royal updates as they develop. Alright, let's break down exactly what happened, because the internal timeline here is genuinely wild and reveals a monarchy at war with itself. It began when King Charles read the final, drafted announcement entirely alone in his private study, and then deliberately placed the heavy document flat against his mahogany desk, without saying a single word to his waiting aides. That specific, heavy silence matters profoundly, because the king fully understood that this was not a simple diary change or a shifting of patronages. Official state duties are the absolute core, fundamental responsibilities performed for the crown, encompassing massive ceremonial appearances, international diplomatic receptions, vital patronage visits, and high-stakes engagements standing directly beside the sovereign. By actively approving this massive transfer of power, Charles wasn't just casually asking his incredibly loyal sister to cover a few empty slots in a busy calendar. He was forcefully handing her an entire, encompassing role, one that had painstakingly become completely identified with his own wife over decades of grueling public relations rehabilitation. Camilla reportedly received a brief, cold confirmation of this decision from a senior courtier only moments before the palace statement was blasted out to the global press. Crucially, she didn't argue with the messenger, she didn't raise her voice, and she didn't throw a tantrum. The Queen Consort simply quietly asked whether Charles had personally, explicitly approved every single word of that document. When the terrifying answer came back as an undeniable yes, her expression reportedly hardened into stone. She realized in that exact moment that she wasn't just losing a few glamorous engagements, but rather she was learning that the very man beside whom she had fiercely fought for decades to gain public and institutional acceptance had just personally authorized her immediate removal from the exact duties that finally proved she truly belonged. Meanwhile, Princess Anne was abruptly summoned to the king's office without any of her usual ceremonial fanfare and was physically handed a thick, sealed briefing folder. She opened it to find a completely revised royal calendar, carrying her own name heavily plastered across receptions, national memorials, high-level patronage visits, and highly sensitive diplomatic meetings. The palace communications team desperately tried to frame this to the press as a temporary, emergency restructuring meant to reorganize responsibilities immediately and prevent any embarrassing gap in royal service. But the sheer, meticulous preparation of the documents revealed something much colder and vastly more calculated. This decision had been actively building, quietly and ruthlessly, well before Camilla was ever formally informed of her own downfall. One specific, devastating line in the briefing folder carried the ultimate threat, stating that the transfer of duties would remain in full force until the sovereign determined otherwise. In plain, unvarnished terms, that meant that Charles alone held the absolute power to decide whether his wife would ever be allowed to reclaim those prestigious duties. Anne reportedly paused over that heavy sentence, her eyes scanning the page, and then turned to the very first engagement listed under her newly expanded authority. It happened to be a major, highly publicized state reception that Camilla had been enthusiastically planning for months, an event that even included a deeply personal welcome speech she had painstakingly written herself. Anne quietly closed the folder, but according to those close to her, she felt absolutely no sense of victory or triumph. She felt instead the crushing, suffocating pressure of stepping directly into another woman's hard-won place, while her brother's fragile marriage actively strained under the weight of his own royal signature. Elsewhere inside the sprawling palace, Camilla fully understood that this upcoming reception, an event entirely meant to confirm her untouchable standing on the world stage, would instead serve to officially introduce Princess Anne as the monarchy's undisputed, unshakable center of duty. But before Anne could even step into that incredibly awkward role, the palace machinery had to desperately confront the painful, undeniable truth that this was not simply a bureaucratic transfer of duties. It was a violent, high-speed collision between personal loyalty, a complicated marriage, and the ultimate survival of the royal institution itself. To the general public, Princess Anne and Queen Camilla have always occupied completely different, distinct corners of royal life, one widely known for her relentless, uncomplaining, ironclad duty, and the other famous for steadfastly standing beside the king through decades of global controversy and intense public hatred. Yet behind the formal, televised smiles existed a far more delicate, incredibly fragile balance of power that had now permanently broken. It revealed that the duties being transferred were not merely appointments on a calendar, but rather they represented ultimate trust, elevated status, and the most vital proximity to the crown itself. Anne studied the heavily revised schedule at her private desk and felt only the heavy burden of consequence. The Princess Royal had built her stellar, bulletproof reputation through decades of flawless discipline, absolute punctuality, and grueling service without a single public complaint. She had become the one person the palace entirely trusted whenever the stability of the institution began to violently shake. Yet this specific assignment carried a different, much darker weight entirely. She was not simply filling an empty place left by illness or retirement. She was actively stepping into duties that had become the core of Camilla's public identity. Anne knew that every single successful appearance she made could easily look to the outside world like undeniable proof that the queen consort had been completely, effortlessly replaced. Across the palace, Camilla opened her own reception folder and slowly, painfully, removed the handwritten speech she had prepared weeks earlier. She had written each and every word of that welcoming address with Charles in mind, genuinely believing the highly visible event would finally confirm her permanent place beside him after enduring years of brutal criticism and institutional resistance. A state role means representing the physical embodiment of the crown at official ceremonies, high-stakes diplomatic meetings, and vital public engagements on behalf of the monarchy. For Camilla, losing that supreme role meant losing vastly more than just a busy schedule. It meant helplessly watching the clearest, most undeniable symbol of her global acceptance be unceremoniously passed into another woman's hands. Anne turned another page in her briefing packet and noticed names she had absolutely not expected to see, right as a senior aide entered the room and quietly informed her that several key household staff members had already been officially reassigned from Camilla's office to support Anne's rapidly expanded workload. Household staff are the crucial private secretaries, master planners, and elite advisors who manage a royal figure's official responsibilities. Their sudden, permanent transfer proved to anyone paying attention that this restructuring reached far, far beyond a single reception or a temporary diary adjustment. The palace was absolutely not preparing a temporary substitute. It was actively, aggressively, building a brand new center of authority around Anne. Camilla discovered the much deeper, far more terrifying loss only moments later, when she realized that her highest-level access to selected, highly confidential diplomatic briefing papers had been instantly suspended. This entirely removed her from the classified material prepared for meetings with foreign representatives and heads of state. She stared at the empty space on her desk, where the red files normally rested, and understood the brutal message instantly. Charles had not only taken away her glamorous public appearances, he had deliberately, forcefully, placed an impenetrable wall of distance between her and the private hidden machinery of royal power. The suffocating pressure tightened as a formal message arrived from her brother-in-law requesting a highly private meeting, while Charles had also summoned his wife separately to his own quarters, desperately hoping to control the massive domestic damage before her simmering resentment hardened into open, uncontrollable conflict. But Camilla flatly refused the summons, sending word that she would absolutely not enter the room until the king explained exactly what specific, inciting incident had persuaded him to act so suddenly and so ruthlessly. Her defiance forced the palace to look backward to the single, fateful ceremony where a private, seemingly petty disagreement became the absolute point of no return. The current crisis had not actually begun with the shocking announcement. It began exactly 3 weeks earlier, buried beneath the polished, glittering formality of a massive diplomatic ceremony. There, one altered seating card, one private objection, and one disastrous decision made completely without the king's approval turned quiet, simmering tension into open, toxic distrust. Everyone present at that event had continued smiling for the cameras, but behind closed doors, Charles understood that a massive constitutional boundary had been crossed, and Anne had witnessed the exact moment everything irrevocably changed. Anne had noticed the revised seating card only minutes before the Commonwealth Service of Renewal was due to begin. She realized with a shock that the Princess Royal had been abruptly placed behind two significantly less senior representatives and completely removed from her rightful, historical position directly beside her brother during the central presentation. The order of precedence is the strict, official ranking that decides exactly where each royal figure stands during formal events, and casually changing it is never, ever, a harmless, accidental detail. It directly affects visual status, perceived authority, and the undeniable message sent to every single diplomat and camera lens watching the room. Anne folded the card once, her face an unreadable mask of calm, and approached Camilla privately before the doors opened. She asked whether the sudden change had been deliberate, actively keeping her voice low, even as the massive, intentional insult settled heavily between them. The Queen Consort did not attempt to deny it, replying coldly that the monarchy must reflect the king's household first. That phrase made the underlying meaning painfully, brutally clear. Anne was being aggressively pushed aside, not because of the demands of the ceremony, but because her undeniable, lifelong closeness to Charles had become a psychological threat to Camilla. Camilla held her ground in that moment, yet the decision carried infinitely more risk than she was willing to admit. The originally approved arrangement had placed Anne beside the king, specifically because she was leading the presentation of a massive, brand-new Commonwealth initiative. Forcefully moving her weakened the structural integrity of the entire event, and heavily suggested to the watching world that a petty personal rivalry mattered vastly more to the Queen Consort than the sovereign's own meticulously crafted plan. Still, Anne completely refused to react publicly. She instantly returned to her newly assigned, diminished place, flawlessly completed every single duty required of her, and fiercely protected the dignity of the ceremony, while silently swallowing the massive public humiliation. Charles only learned the terrifying truth about the seating arrangement hours after the final guest had departed, when a highly agitated senior courtier placed the original, king-approved plan directly beside the altered version. He carefully explained that His Majesty's supreme authority had been falsely used to approve the change completely, without his consent or knowledge. The king stared at both documents in deafening silence, and understood the much deeper, catastrophic betrayal. His sovereign name had not been conveniently borrowed by a stressed aide to solve a practical logistical problem. It had been actively, maliciously used by his wife's office to settle a private, insecure struggle over royal rank. The courtier then produced a documented, time-stamped email sent directly to Camilla's office hours before the ceremony. It clearly and explicitly warned that the king's order of precedence must absolutely not be altered under any circumstances. She had received the explicit instruction, she had fully understood it, and she had chosen to aggressively ignore it anyway. When Charles later privately asked Anne why she had remained so completely silent during the event, she answered with chilling clarity that she would never, ever embarrass the crown in public, but she would absolutely not allow the exact same thing to happen twice. That haunting answer stayed heavily with Charles until the night he finally brought both Anne and Camilla into the same private sitting room and demanded the absolute truth face to face, ensuring there were no photographers, no private secretaries taking frantic notes, and no fake ceremonial smiles to soften the brutal reality of the moment. Charles entered the room first, projecting absolute authority. Anne followed quietly, and Camilla arrived last. When the heavy oak door finally closed, the argument was instantly no longer about a trivial seating card or a reception schedule, but rather it became a massive, unprecedented reckoning over ultimate authority, public humiliation, and the terrifying question of whether private, marital loyalty had been weaponized to manipulate the public, constitutional machinery of the crown. Charles ordered every single aide to remain standing outside in the corridor and deliberately placed the damning documents flat on the table directly between the two women. The king had specifically chosen a private sitting room because this crisis was simultaneously deeply personal and massively constitutional. Constitutional authority means the absolute power legally attached to the sovereign's official role, not simply his emotional wishes as a husband or an older brother. On that table rested the revised ceremony plan, the ignored palace warning, and the printed email that proved someone had used his sacred name to approve a change he never, ever accepted. Camilla spoke first, fiercely insisting that she had acted solely to protect the ultimate dignity of the sovereign's immediate household, arguing passionately that the people closest to Charles should always stand at the visual center of all royal events. She then pivoted to accuse Anne of treating every minor, necessary adjustment as a deep personal wound, stating that the palace could not keep constantly bending its modern image around one woman's archaic pride. Her voice remained rigidly controlled, but the boiling, defensive anger underneath it was absolutely impossible to hide. Anne answered without raising her voice a single decibel. She stated firmly that the insult had never, ever been about where she physically stood on a carpet, but rather it was entirely about the king's ultimate authority being illegally borrowed without his explicit permission. She pointed out that Charles had personally approved one specific arrangement, yet a completely different one had been imposed in his name. She looked directly, unblinkingly at Camilla and made the devastating accusation plain. Private, paranoid insecurity had been recklessly placed above public, constitutional duty, and absolutely everyone sitting in the room knew it. Charles then asked the terrifying question neither woman could avoid. Had Camilla actually known that the revised order had already been explicitly rejected by his office? A suffocating silence followed. Camilla finally admitted that she had indeed seen the warning, but genuinely believed her husband would simply support the decision once the ceremony was over and the optics were secured. The confession struck Charles vastly harder than a denial ever could have, because it proved she had not misunderstood a complex instruction. She had willfully, arrogantly chosen to ignore it. Charles slowly removed his glasses, set them heavily beside the scattered papers, and then revealed to the room that an emergency transfer of duties had already been formally drafted by his legal team. Such an order is a massive, highly formal instruction transferring official responsibilities from one royal figure to another, entirely without delay. Camilla's expression changed instantly as she realized this meeting was not a stern warning, and it was absolutely not an attempt at marital reconciliation. The decision had already moved completely beyond words. Camilla rose sharply from her chair and faced her husband one final time during that explosive confrontation. She told Charles that actually signing the order would do vastly more than just weaken her position. It would openly reveal to the entire world who truly controlled the palace, and who had already quietly decided that Anne was the safer, more reliable choice. Her final, echoing words raised a much more dangerous, paranoid question. Was Charles truly acting alone, or had a hidden, powerful circle of courtiers and heirs already decided that Princess Anne was the monarchy's safest future bet? Royal power rarely moves through a single, dramatic, shouted command. It moves silently through calendars, private secretaries, dense legal language, security briefings, and the quiet, unspoken agreement of the people who fundamentally understand what cannot be allowed to fail. Charles may have ultimately signed the order, but the massive machinery behind it had been turning for days, and Anne's name had emerged again and again, in every single strategy meeting, as the absolute only answer everyone entirely trusted. Charles had listened carefully as his private office measured the immense collateral damage. He watched as the king's advisors worked frantically through patronages, highly sensitive foreign visits, massive investitures, military ceremonies, and countless appearances already promised in the packed royal calendar. An investiture is a highly formal ceremony where the sovereign, or another very senior royal, presents honors to members of the public. Abruptly canceling such duties would create massive embarrassment at home and extreme uncertainty abroad, meaning replacing Camilla slowly, over a period of months, was simply not a viable option. The palace desperately needed someone who could step forward immediately, without a single moment of hesitation. Anne offered that absolute, ironclad certainty, because the princess already carried a demanding, punishing workload, completely understood the rigid constitutional boundaries, and had flawlessly avoided the messy personal controversies that could turn every single appearance into another media argument. Her relentless discipline made her the absolute strongest choice, but that very strength created its own unique danger. The more flawlessly dependable she appeared, the more Camilla's sudden removal would look incredibly deliberate, coldly permanent, and deeply, viciously personal. Prince William had received the confidential briefing in private and chose every single word of his response carefully. He told his father that Anne could undoubtedly steady the fragile institution, fiercely protect the schedule, and reassure nervous foreign guests. He then delivered the brutal warning Charles had been desperately avoiding. The decision might save the monarchy's public face in the short term, but it could permanently, irrevocably damage his marriage. The future king fundamentally understood that royal stability often demanded brutal human sacrifice, yet he also deeply knew that some wounds simply did not close when the press announcement ended. Charles then admitted something to his son that the advisors had absolutely not expected him to say. He felt he had profoundly failed both women. He had failed Camilla as a husband by allowing her intense fear and insecurity to grow for years without challenge. And he had failed Anne as a brother by constantly asking her to endure quiet, painful humiliations in the desperate name of family peace. The king now faced the cruel, inescapable result of that long silence, realizing that relentlessly protecting one relationship had ultimately weakened them all. The advisors then presented highly documented concerns from several foreign delegations, written accounts that described frustrating last-minute changes, abruptly altered guest arrangements, and confusing instructions originating from Camilla's office that actively conflicted with approved, established plans. This proved that the seating ceremony dispute had not been an isolated incident, but had merely exposed a vast, toxic pattern that absolutely no one could ignore any longer. Anne finally agreed to serve, but only after making one absolute, non-negotiable demand. No public statement could ever suggest she had requested, pursued, or actively campaigned for the role. She would accept the heavy burden of duty, but she would absolutely not accept a narrative of victory. Before dawn broke over London, the heavily revised roster was circulated through the secure internal servers, and one recipient immediately, anonymously, sent it directly to Camilla's household. By sunrise, the decision had completely escaped the secure room where it was made, and Camilla was forced to begin dismantling the highly structured life that had been painstakingly built around her official position. The absolute most brutal sign of her lost power was not a scathing public statement or a hostile tabloid headline. It was an entirely empty calendar. Engagements that had proudly carried Camilla's name for months vanished one by one, instantly replaced by Anne's. Speeches were abruptly reassigned, security briefings were removed from her desk, and familiar, trusted staff were redirected to other offices. For the very first time since becoming central to royal life, Camilla was forced to sit in silence and watch the monarchy continue seamlessly without needing her. Camilla sat frozen with her private secretary as heavy briefing books, transport plans, speech drafts, and extensive guest lists were physically carried away from her office, watching months of intense preparation disappear in absolute silence. Briefing books are the vital, official files containing schedules, background notes, names, and precise guidance for royal engagements. And without them in her possession, she no longer had the basic information needed to represent the crown. It was a visceral loss that made the transfer real in a way no public announcement ever could. Camilla ran her trembling finger across the crossed-out appointments in her diary. A hospital visit, a high-profile diplomatic luncheon, a solemn military commemoration, and the massive state reception had all been reassigned without a single day of delay. Each event had mattered immensely because it physically connected her to the public role she had spent her entire adult life fighting to build. She had endured relentless suspicion, brutal criticism, and intense institutional resistance to finally reach the center of royal life, only for one single morning to strip away the absolute proof that the agonizing struggle had actually meant something. Camilla quietly asked whether any official duty whatsoever remained under her control, and her private secretary hesitated painfully before explaining that only entirely private, charitable contact could continue. She could support causes personally as a wealthy individual, but she could absolutely not appear on behalf of the monarchy. The distinction cut incredibly deeply. She could still care, still write checks, still offer help, but she could no longer speak with the massive, historical authority of the crown standing behind her. The fracture widened immediately inside her own household. One longtime, fiercely loyal aide flatly refused to transfer to Anne's team and resigned on the spot, stating that loyalty could not simply be reassigned like a diary entry, while another aide accepted the new position without a word of protest. Camilla heard about both decisions and deeply understood what they revealed. Even the people closest around her were now being forced to choose between personal, emotional attachment and cold, institutional survival. Charles sent a deeply personal, handwritten note asking her to meet him before Anne's very first major appearance in her place. The king did not send a junior aide or a formal, typed summons, but wrote the desperate request himself, desperately hoping something personal might still reach her through the anger. Camilla read it exactly once, then left it completely unanswered beside the space where her state files used to sit. Her silence was absolutely not calm, but rather, it was the only piece of control she felt she had left in the world. Anne learned that the king's note remained untouched and felt the heavy burden of the situation shift again. She fundamentally understood that performing the duties without facing the immense emotional damage would turn her royal service into a silent, agonizing punishment for everyone involved. So, before stepping out to appear in Camilla's place, Anne crossed the vast palace entirely alone and asked for the one incredibly difficult conversation everyone else had been far too afraid to arrange. No aides announced Anne's arrival at the door, and absolutely no official record preserved what followed as she entered carrying neither the heavy-duty folder nor the immense authority that had suddenly been placed in her hands. Camilla was waiting rigidly beside a closed diary, fully prepared for a bitter accusation. Instead, Anne offered something infinitely more difficult to swallow, the unvarnished truth. Without any royal ceremony, without hovering witnesses, and completely without the protection of royal titles, Anne had requested the meeting before assuming control of the state reception, because the princess firmly believed the massive transfer could not successfully begin while both women remained trapped in toxic silence. Camilla had agreed to the meeting only after confirming that Charles would absolutely not attend, knowing that without the king present, there would be no institutional buffer, the formal protection created when royal authority, slick advisors, or official procedure stands between two people in conflict. This time, neither woman could hide behind the shield of duty. Anne spoke first, telling Camilla with absolute sincerity that she had never, ever wanted to reassign the duties, and did not view the king's decision as a personal victory in the slightest. She acknowledged that every single engagement she accepted would carry the heavy, visible weight of another woman's loss. Yet, she explained that she simply could not refuse when the crown's ultimate stability was at stake. She pointed out that empty chairs, abruptly cancelled visits, and highly uncertain foreign guests would damage vastly more than one household. They would make the entire monarchy appear dangerously weak at the exact historical moment it desperately needed absolute control. Camilla listened quietly, then finally admitted what she had fiercely refused to say in front of Charles. The queen consort confessed that the altered ceremony order had stemmed entirely from deep, festering insecurity. She admitted that Anne's respect inside the palace always seemed entirely effortless and innate, while her own place beside the king had been painfully built through years of brutal resistance. Every single time the princess stood closely beside her brother, Camilla deeply feared the inevitable comparison, knowing that one woman looked naturally, historically trusted, while the other still felt she had to constantly, desperately prove she belonged. Anne did not attempt to soften the brutal truth of the situation, but she did reveal something completely unexpected. She had formally asked Charles to review the entire transfer after exactly 3 months. The princess carefully explained that a formal review meant the king would be forced to reconsider whether the arrangement should continue once the immediate crisis and public scrutiny had passed. This proved she had absolutely not requested permanent control, and she had zero desire to turn a temporary duty into a lasting permanent exclusion. Camilla slowly opened the reception folder, removed the unfinished, handwritten speech she had been working on, handed it directly to Anne, and quietly asked that the opening tribute remain completely unchanged, because it honored Charles, not either of them. The gesture absolutely did not instantly restore their shattered trust, but it completely broke the icy silence that had hardened around them. And as Anne accepted the pages, for the very first time, Camilla did not see a victorious enemy taking her hard-won place. When Anne left the room, Camilla slowly picked up the king's handwritten note, read it again, and then finally walked toward the private sitting room, where Charles had been anxiously waiting. Their resulting conversation did not miraculously restore Camilla's lost authority, but it profoundly changed the meaning of Anne's first massive public appearance, and the entire world was about to witness that subtle difference. By the time Anne physically arrived at the state reception, the palace announcement had already become a massive, global national spectacle. Every single gesture, glance, and movement was being hyper-examined by the press for signs of triumph, bitter resentment, or rebellion. Yet, the absolute defining image of the evening was not of Anne grandly entering beneath royal banners. It was a candid photograph taken just seconds before the massive doors opened, showing the princess securely holding Camilla's handwritten speech, her thumb resting gently over a line the other woman had chosen to erase. Broadcasters across the country interrupted regular programming as the reception began, breathlessly explaining that Anne had now assumed the complete, sweeping state schedule transferred from Camilla, not merely one isolated appearance. A state reception is a highly formal, critical gathering where senior royals welcome powerful diplomats, government officials, and honored guests on behalf of the crown. This specific event mattered immensely because any sign of confusion or awkwardness would heavily suggest that private, petty conflict had severely weakened the monarchy's ability to perform its most basic public duties. Anne paused deeply before entering the room, knowing full well that success carried its own specific cruelty. If she appeared fully, flawlessly confident, Camilla's brutal removal would seem completely justified to the press. But if she hesitated even slightly, Charles's massive decision would look incredibly reckless and destabilizing. Palace staff had spoken repeatedly to the press about seamless continuity, heavily insisting that royal obligations would proceed entirely without disruption. Yet Anne intimately understood that every calm, measured word she delivered would be directly measured against the woman whose actual speech remained firmly in her hands. Camilla watched the live broadcast in silence beside Charles, hearing Anne begin with the exact, heartfelt tribute she had written for the king. A deep, complicated grief rose beside her reluctant pride. Her carefully chosen words were still actively serving the crown, even though she no longer possessed the right to speak them herself. Charles remained completely silent throughout the broadcast, but watched his wife closely, seeing that the moment undeniably hurt her, but also seeing that Anne had actively, gracefully, refused to erase her presence from the evening. The striking photograph of Anne holding the speech spread across the internet before the reception had even ended. A massive national newspaper placed it across their entire front page, beneath the bold headline, "The duty passes, but the words remain." The powerful image instantly changed the volatile public mood. Anne no longer appeared to be a rival, celebrating a ruthless victory, but rather she appeared to be a devoted servant, carrying a massive responsibility, while actively preserving the dignity of the woman who had tragically lost it. Outside the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace, a large crowd gathered beneath the famous balcony. One woman lifted a simple handwritten sign reading, "Service without revenge," a phrase that others quickly began repeating as the television cameras turned toward them. The public had rapidly found its defining symbol for the crisis. Not the humiliating fall of Camilla, but Anne's steadfast refusal to turn that fall into a public execution. Charles received a final, quiet message after the reception concluded, indicating that Camilla was finally ready to meet him. The king understood that this next conversation would permanently decide whether her sweeping removal became a lifelong punishment or the difficult beginning of an entirely different role. The public had already delivered its overwhelmingly positive judgment on Anne, but only Charles and Camilla could decide what actually remained of their complicated marriage, and what her institutional removal would finally, historically mean. The absolute final meaning of the crisis was decided completely away from the flashing cameras, as Charles and Camilla sat opposite each other, with no press announcement prepared, and no slick advisors waiting in the wings to shape their raw words. The massive state duties would absolutely not be returned, and Anne would continue carrying them without complaint. But the heavy conversation that followed transformed the decision from a brutal act of public rejection into a painful, necessary institutional boundary, one that ultimately saved the monarchy while forcing every single person involved to face the staggering human cost. Charles spoke plainly, without hiding behind any formal, bureaucratic language. He confirmed to his wife that Anne would indeed retain every single transferred state duty for the foreseeable future, because absolute consistency, unshakable trust, and clear, undeniable authority now had to come before any personal comfort. State representation means physically appearing and speaking on behalf of the crown during massive official ceremonies, high-stakes diplomatic engagements, and deeply emotional national occasions. Returning those vast responsibilities too quickly would instantly weaken the decision and heavily suggest to the world that royal authority could be blatantly ignored without any lasting consequence. Camilla listened in silence until he finished. She accepted that the queen consort would indeed remain closely beside her husband in private family life and attend limited, highly personal occasions. But she would absolutely no longer direct the massive official program that had placed her at the very center of public duty. She admitted softly that losing the busy schedule felt exactly like losing the final, undeniable proof that their long, agonizing struggle against the world had actually been accepted. Decades of vicious criticism had only seemed worth enduring because the monarchy had eventually, finally given her a highly visible place. Now that that powerful symbol was gone, Charles did not attempt to dismiss or minimize the pain. He acknowledged that her immense loss was entirely real, but he steadfastly refused to reverse the sweeping order. The monarch then bravely admitted his own deepest failure, confessing that his prolonged, cowardly silence had allowed the toxic insecurity between Camilla and Anne to deepen for years, until every small, necessary adjustment carried the crushing weight of bitter rivalry. By entirely refusing to set firm, clear boundaries much earlier, he had desperately protected a temporary, fragile peace, while actively allowing the foundational trust to break completely beneath it. Anne received a quiet, handwritten message later that same evening. Finding only 2 sentences inside from her sister-in-law, Camilla asked her to fiercely protect the specific charitable causes attached to the transferred role, and promised that she would absolutely not interfere in the schedule again. The message carried absolutely no demand for public recognition, and no desperate attempt to secretly recover control. It was the very first undeniable sign that true acceptance had finally replaced bitter resistance. Anne preserved those vital causes within the heavily revised schedule, flatly refusing to erase Camilla's hard work simply because the ultimate authority had changed hands. That decision definitively proved that taking immense responsibility did not actually require humiliating the woman who had held it before. Duty could remain incredibly firm without ever becoming cruel. The massive transfer of power became the absolute clearest statement of the modern monarchy King Charles intended to lead. Affection could shape their private life, but official, institutional trust had to be brutally earned, fiercely protected, and never, ever borrowed without explicit consent. And when Princess Anne stepped confidently forward into the blinding spotlight, while Camilla quietly stepped back into the shadows, the British monarchy did not celebrate a winner. It survived, only because 3 deeply wounded people finally accepted the brutal truth that duty, without absolute trust, is only empty ceremony, but duty actively guided by fierce accountability can still fiercely protect the crown.